Good evening and welcome. My name is Arlene Montevecchio, and I am the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. As many of you know, the Center for Spirituality was founded in 1984 with generous support of the Sisters of Holy Cross, many of whom are here tonight, including some of the leadership. So let's show them our gratitude. Before introducing our speaker, I have to ask you to silence your cell phones. And I'm also curious, did anyone tonight see this event on our newly launched Facebook page? Anyone? At least one person. That's great. Well, if you are on Facebook and you are willing to like us, it is facebook.com/SMC Center for Spirituality. And that'll be a new way we're pushing out some of our information. It is my great privilege tonight to introduce our guest lecturer, Dr. William Cavanaugh. Dr. Cavanaugh is Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago. He is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, Cambridge University, and Duke University. He is the author of 6 books and editor of 3, and he was a Holy Cross Associate in Chile for 2 years. Dr. Cavanaugh's interests include political theology, economic ethics, and ecclesiology. Please join me tonight in welcoming William Cavanaugh to deliver our second Endowed Fall Lecture, Projects of the Heart, Pope Francis and Microeconomics.
Well, thanks, Arlene, for the kind invitation and introduction as well. I kind of feel like I'm amongst friends here. As Arlene mentioned, I went to a college not far from here and have a lot of friends who are still here at St. Mary's and know some wonderful alumni as well from St. Mary's, and have a great deal of admiration for what you do here in providing women's education. I have family here. They told me that they've been tailgating for the last couple hours, so if they get rowdy, then we have to call security on them. My son and brother and niece and her husband are here as well. My great nephew stayed home to have chicken nuggets, so that's probably, I think he chose the wise portion on that. Before I start, does anybody know what the Cubs are doing? Have the Cubs won yet or not? Is it still 1-1? Okay, all right, great. If you hear my brother say yes during the middle of the talk, it's not because of something I said. So. This lecture series is sponsored by the Center for Spirituality, and economics doesn't sound like it has to do with spirituality, but part of what I'm going to try to convince you of, if you're not already convinced, is that economics and spirituality are very much intertwined, and that our spirituality is inherently intertwined with how we deal with the material world. And I think Pope Francis has a very keen sense of that as well. Pope Francis is known as the Pope of Mercy, the Pope who said, "Who am I to judge?" Right? Eugene Kennedy has written that in the spirit of Vatican II, Pope Francis wants a church that serves the world's needs rather than condemns its faults. The one area where Francis seems to deviate from this script, however, is in matters of economics. Here, his denunciations are sharp and unrelenting. Francis rarely speaks about economic matters without condemning the idolatry of the modern economy. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis writes, "The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose." Here somebody has assigned that quote to the famous picture. You know where this picture is from, right? Wall Street, yeah. Such an economy kills, Francis adds. And though the economy is impersonal, the ideologies that sustain it are not. They're perpetrated by the culpable actions of elites about whom Francis writes unsparingly. As Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Bergoglio wrote, quote, "No one can accept the precepts of neoliberalism and consider themselves Christian." A remarkable, strong quote. And as Pope Francis, he's written that some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. So he clearly doubts the goodness of those wielding economic power and even talks about the sacralization, the kind of idolization of this kind of economy. And those doubts are expressed as well in his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, where he accuses those in power of, quote, masking the problems or concealing their symptoms, end quote. So one free market advocate comments, a Catholic free market advocate, "I know of no other social encyclical in which the truthfulness and motives of any party were questioned as relentlessly as the honesty of businesses and market advocates is impugned here." So free market advocates have responded to Pope Francis, and although their critiques vary, the common theme is that Francis doesn't understand economics. Some have tried to chalk up his ignorance to his Argentinian background in two mutually contradictory ways. So some people say Francis is a Peronist who has an affinity for the kind of state-centered populism that Juan Perón instituted in Argentina. Other people say that Francis has an aversion to the kind of dysfunctional crony capitalism found under Peronism, and thus what Francis thinks of as capitalism is not really capitalism at all. Two contradictory arguments, but you find them both in the same book. Either way, the charge is that Francis does not understand how capitalism works to create opportunities and defend freedom, to pull people out of poverty, and even protect the environment. They assume that Francis is a foe of markets and an advocate of what Lawrence McQuilland and Hay and Carroll Park called forced redistribution through the state. So the contest is set up then between the market and the state, and it's assumed that Francis is in the latter camp. So I think this binary of market and state drastically oversimplifies the options that are available for a sane economy and distorts the discussion. I also think it distorts Pope Francis's position. Although he certainly recognizes the importance of state regulation to tame the worst excesses of capitalism, I argue that he has a much more interesting proposal to make, what he calls projects of the heart, which escape the simple market versus state binary. So I'm going to examine some critiques of Francis on economics and then argue that Francis stands within a much more interesting tradition of Catholic localism that moves beyond the logic of either market or state. So the recent book, this is the book that I just referred to, Pope Francis and the Caring Society, brings together major Catholic free market advocates and economists to dialogue with Francis on economics. So Andrew Jungert's contribution is typical in its statement that, quote, "the account of markets in Francis's work is entirely negative." End quote. One of the questions that such a sweeping statement raises is what we mean when we talk about markets. What Francis attacks and what his critics defend are markets free of any necessary logic other than the pursuit of individual self-interest. So Milton Friedman defines a free market as one in which two parties enter into an exchange that is bilaterally informed and voluntary. In other words, both parties know what they're getting and they enter into the exchange in pursuit of their own self-interest without being coerced by another party, especially the state. So what's produced, in what quantity, how it's priced are all established by suppliers meeting demand created just by the decentralized choices of individuals, what I decide I want. and not by government ownership and state planning. So the market doesn't set objectively desirable ends of human life. Milton Friedman says, a free market economy gives people what they want instead of what a particular group thinks they ought to want. Underlying most arguments against the free market is a lack of belief in freedom itself. So freedom itself is pursuing what you want without interference from others, most notably the state. So the state is necessary to enforce private property rights, but the free market advocates insist that the state shouldn't interfere in the operation of supply and demand. So how could Pope Francis possibly object to that, right? Doesn't he believe in freedom? Pope Francis looks around and he sees that there are many people that are not free in the so-called free market. People are forced off ancestral lands and into low-paying wage labor. Many labor for the profit of others and can barely feed themselves and their families. As businesses pursue their self-interest, they shop around for cheap labor, paying less than 30 cents an hour in some places. By Friedman's definition, such a transaction is free if both parties enter willingly, right? So the corporation expects to benefit from low wages, and the teenage Thai girl expects an improvement over starvation. Taking advantage of someone else's desperation, though, is defined as free because the definition ignores the question of power. So what do parties bring to the market, and how can they compete fairly if some parties have enormous resources and power and others have nothing but the labor of their own bodies to offer? And furthermore, how did some people come to have enormous resources in the first place and others nothing? Pope Francis writes, "Today everything comes under the laws of competition and the survival of the fittest, where the powerful feed upon the powerless. As a consequence, masses of people find themselves excluded and marginalized, without work, without possibilities, without any means of escape." So the question of power, I think, is really crucial, but free market advocates refuse to factor it into the question of freedom. So freedom is defined by free market advocates purely negatively as the lack of interference with one's will. In the market, there is no objectively available telos or ends of human life. What is life for? Right? The irony is that in the absence of any objective ends, all that remains is a competition of one will against another, and the one with the most power wins. So the definition of a free market pretends to be blind to the disparity of power between transnational corporations and peasants, while stripping away the ability to judge an exchange on the basis of anything but sheer power, because any common end or common standard of good has been eliminated. Pope Francis, on the other, so you say, well, we can't decide what people want, everybody just decides what they want. And so you claim then that this is neutral, everybody's free, but you've kind of claimed to be blind to the disparity of power that exists in this market. But once you strip away any kind of ends, then there's nothing but power. There's nothing but one will over against another. Francis, on the other hand, calls attention to the basic question of ends. What is human life for? What's an economy for? Are people flourishing in the modern economy or not? That's the crucial question. And not just, are they able to pursue their own wills? Pope Francis, on the basis of the Christian tradition, thinks that God and the reconciliation of all creation, those are the ends of human life. So he and his papal predecessors define freedom not simply negatively as freedom from interference, but positively as the ability to accomplish a good end. So to be free, one needs certain basic goods that every human needs. So the implication is that there is no free market as such to be either for or against. He's not against the free market. He's not for the free market. The crucial question is, when is a market free and when it's not? And to judge when a market is free in this positive sense, you need to appeal to the true ends of human life. A market or transaction is free when it contributes to the flourishing of the parties involved, and that, for Francis, includes the earth. So Francis doesn't reject markets as such. He rejects free market ideologies that in fact only guarantee freedom for the powerful, those who already have access to capital. He's in favor of markets that free people, in the positive sense, to achieve their true ends as human persons. So the question then becomes, who's to decide what human flourishing is in a pluralistic society where people disagree on the ends of human life? So in the book, Pope Francis and the Caring Society, the introduction frames the question in terms of two alternatives. You got two choices. You got capitalism and you've got socialism. Capitalism is defined as a socioeconomic system in which resources are owned, operated, and traded for the purpose of generating profits by private individuals, acting either singly or jointly. Investment, production, pricing, the distribution of resources, goods, and services are determined by the decentralized choices of individuals in a market economy. In a capitalist system, the private rights and property relations of individuals are protected by the rule of law. That's what the state's for, and that's only what the state is for. So that system, then, capitalism, is contrasted with socialism, the centrally planned allocation of scarce resources and government ownership or control of various combinations of land, labor, and capital. And those are your two choices. So with those as the only two alternatives on offer, either the market or the state, Francis is criticized throughout the volume for siding with the latter. So McQuillan and Park write that Francis views forced government redistribution of income and wealth as acceptable and necessary to remedy inequality and to produce more socially just outcomes. And they go on to say, darkly, history demonstrates, however, that redistribution motivated by social justice ultimately leads to totalitarian government. Right? So that's the road we're headed down. I found this meme on Google Images. That's what you get. That's what you get with social justice, right? So the question then becomes, are the market and the state the only alternatives? Are those our only two choices, capitalism and socialism? And does Francis clearly choose the latter? Well, I think there's no question that Francis does refer to government curbs on the freedom of the powerful. In reference to massive and growing inequality, Francis writes in Evangelii Gaudium, this imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. A new tyranny is thus born, invisible and often virtual, which unilaterally and relentlessly imposes its own laws and rules. Doesn't sound much like freedom, right? Pope Francis mentions the responsibility of governments while stating it's becoming increasingly difficult to find a local solution for enormous global problems which overwhelm local politics with difficulties to resolve. So twice he mentions the role of the state for safeguarding the common good. He also says, though, you got to invoke the principle of subsidiarity. So do things at the lowest level you can. And he calls the state's role, he says the state's role calls for profound social humility. So as low to the ground as you can get. In Laudato Si, paragraphs 175 through 181 stress the responsibility of governments from the local to the international level to protect the environment. So it's clear that Pope Francis thinks that governments at all levels need to protect people against the predations of the powerful. He never, however, calls for states to control and centrally plan the economy, nor does he ever call for state ownership of the means of production. He's not a socialist, right? So what is he then? Does Francis choose the state over the market? Well, I think that very choice, at least in American politics, is often usually illusory. We think we have this two-party system, right, where we have the Republicans and the Democrats, and we think that the Republicans are the party of the corporation, the Democrats are the party of the state, and those are your choices. You got to choose one or the other. One problem with that narrative, I think, is that it ignores the extent to which the state and the corporation have become so densely intertwined in our system. And that, I think, is really one of the profoundest myths that we can't seem to get around. What appears to be a stark choice between state and market is not so stark when there's this constantly revolving door between government and business, such that government is primarily tasked with serving corporate interests that are too big to fail. Right? Here's some statistics on that. $36 a year for food stamps, $870 for corporate subsidies. Free market ideology protects corporations from state curbs on corporate power, while corporations simultaneously avail themselves of massive state subsidies and state protection from having to face the discipline of the market for reckless behavior. So the banks in the last meltdown were like teenagers with an allowance, right? And they kept getting more allowance. In his encyclical Caritas and Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI critiques the collaboration of the state and the market together in terms of their mutual agreement to exclude charity and gratuitousness. So this now, Pope Benedict XVI, when both the logic of the market and the logic of the state come to an agreement that each will continue to exercise a monopoly over its respective area of influence, in the long term much is lost. Solidarity in relations between citizens, participation, adherence, actions of gratuitousness, all which stand in contrast with either, on the one hand, giving in order to acquire, the logic of exchange, and then giving through duty, the logic of public obligation imposed by state law. The exclusively binary model of market plus state is corrosive of society, while economic forms based on solidarity, which find their natural home in civil society without being restricted to it, build up society. So Pope Benedict is in favor of improving exchange on the one hand, the market, and public welfare, the state, on the other. But he says what's really needed is the formation of alternative spaces that go beyond the logic of market and state. So in addition to recommending what he calls dispersed political authority, which I think is a great phrase, he calls for hybrid forms of commercial behavior. Space needs to be created within the market for economic activity carried out by subjects who freely choose to act according to principles other than those of profit. Isn't that great? Right? Pope Benedict XVI, an amazing radical. Benedict, he advocates attention to scale, encouraging micro-projects that preserve face-to-face personal relationships that don't remain niche enterprises but evangelize the economy as a whole. So despite the frequency with which Pope Francis is contrasted to Pope Benedict XVI, I think they're really on the same page here. They're both anxious to move beyond what Benedict calls the continuing hegemony of the binary model of market plus state. So Francis also critiques the reduction of economic activity to profits, whether it's corporate or state-led. He says, an instrumental way of reasoning which provides a purely static analysis of realities in the service of present needs is at work whether resources are allocated by the market or by state central planning, end quote. In both cases, the problem is the corporate manager or the state bureaucrat looking down from on high, deciding the fates of people, animals, the land, none of which the manager really knows, on the basis of what Francis calls the dominant technocratic paradigm that treats them as resources to be manipulated. Google Images is just full of great stuff here, right? The dominant technocratic paradigm. According to Francis, this exalts a rational subject who gains power by, quote, possession, mastery, transformation of the world. And Francis contrasts this technocratic logic with the same logic of gratuitousness that Benedict highlighted. He says the technological paradigm is as if the subject were to find itself in the presence of something formless, completely open to manipulation. As you hear this quote, think about the spirituality of this, right? It's a certain kind of way of imagining the human subject. and the material world. Men and women have constantly intervened in nature. That's good. But for a long time, this meant being in tune with and respecting the possibilities offered by the things themselves. So you stand ready to receive what the things have, right? It was a matter of receiving what nature itself allowed, as if from its own hand. Now, by contrast, we are the ones to lay our hands on things, attempting to extract everything possible from them while frequently ignoring or forgetting the reality in front of us. So as in Benedict, to be receptive to the gifts of others and the land is to get beyond the logic of either acquisition on the one hand or being forced to give on the other hand, market state. So here Francis gives a hint as to why scale in economics is so important. Small is beautiful, right? Technocratic subjects see things as formless and ignore the reality in front of them because they're looking at reality from 30,000 feet up, right? Sometimes quite literally. Francis, therefore, repeatedly commends small-scale producers as an antidote to this globalized technocratic view. He writes, liberation from the dominant technocratic paradigm does in fact happen sometimes, for example, when cooperatives of small producers adopt less polluting means of production and opt for a non-consumerist model of life, recreation, and community. And later in Laudato Si, he commends, quote, the great variety of small-scale food production systems which feed the greater part of the world's peoples, using a modest amount of land and producing less waste, be it in small agricultural parcels, orchards, or gardens, hunting and wild harvesting, or local fishing, end quote. In the same section, Pope Francis calls on civil authorities, quote, to adopt clear and firm measures in support of small producers and differentiated production. So civil authority is not dispensable, but the job of the civil authorities is not to direct the economy, but to protect freedom. So he says, quote, to ensure economic freedom from which all can effectively benefit, restraints occasionally have to be imposed on those possessing greater resources and financial power, right? That's what free market advocates call a restriction of freedom. Francis calls it a promotion of freedom. By using the language of freedom, Francis has taken a page from the playbook of the free market advocates, but here freedom is not simply defined as lack of interference with sheer power. Freedom is defined more positively as an economy that contributes to the flourishing of all. One aspect of freedom, therefore, is resisting what Francis calls, quote, the progressive disappearance of small producers. So scale is directly related to freedom because we cannot determine when a market is truly free without considering the question of power. Pope Francis expresses concern about the destruction of local cultures and the homogenizing effects that globalized capitalism imposes. In Evangelii Gaudium, Francis quotes the African bishops who denounce their culture's co-optation by globalized power, made to be, quote, parts of a machine, cogs on a gigantic wheel. In Laudato Si, Francis warns the imposition of a dominant lifestyle linked to a single form of production can be just as harmful as the altering of ecosystems. And he rejects, quote, attempts to resolve all problems through uniform regulations. And he calls for the active participation of local communities in decision-making processes. And he cites the examples of cooperatives and that harness renewable energies and ensure local self-sufficiency. Anyway, I could give example after example of that. The problem that Francis is addressing here is that small producers continue to be pushed off their land in the name of efficiency and participation in global markets. There's a great book by Fred Pierce called Land Grabbers. He documents what he calls the final enclosure of the planet's wild places, the last roundup of global commons. And the word enclosure here evokes the process in Europe from the 17th century through the 19th centuries, in which people who relied on common lands for firewood, grazing, pastures, game, medicinal herbs, thatch for roots, etc., all of those, the people were gradually excluded and those lands were privatized. We tend to view enclosure as this past thing right, which was a disruptive but necessary movement on the way to the Industrial Revolution. You push people off their land into factories and so on. Pierce, however, documents that the process of enclosure is ongoing and has lately intensified as corporations, governments, and wealthy individuals take control of huge swaths of land in the global south, often removing the current inhabitants by force. Large-scale industrial farming for markets is being proposed as the solution to poverty, promising abundant food and jobs, but as even one agribusiness executive admitted in 2011, quote, exclusively industrial-scale farming displaces and alienates people, creates few jobs, and causes social disruption, end quote. And that's an advocate talking, right? That's an agribusiness executive. So such solutions are propagated from above by governments and corporations that are at a significant remove from the people on the ground. I'll just give you one example. In the Gambela region of Ethiopia, the government is moving peasant farmers into state-designated villages and handing their fields and forests over to foreign agribusinesses. Most of the rural population of Gambela is being relocated under the terms of the government's contract with the Indian agribusiness giant Caritas. The land must be provided with, quote, vacant possession, and the government must provide security against riots. The government, whose party, by the way, won 100% of the seats in Parliament in the 2015 election, so you know that things are on the up and up there, is ready to comply. The government has used massacres, intimidation, the closing of schools, and other tactics to force people from their homes, and this scenario is being played out in Liberia, Ukraine, Brazil, Indonesia, Cambodia, Mali, and the list goes on and on. It's really, if you want to see Pierce's book, it's an eye-opener. Large-scale monocropping has produced a host of problems, increased vulnerability to epidemics and infestations, pollution, degradation of soil, concentration of political and economic power, reliance on fossil fuels, climate change. It's motivated not simply by greed, but also by the conviction that large-scale agriculture run by experts is the only viable solution to feeding a growing world population. So leases for foreign agribusinesses come with promises of jobs for locals, and most laborers are local people who've been pushed off their land and haven't got anything else to do. Technical personnel, however, are brought in from elsewhere due to the general belief that peasants are backward. And in Gambela, for example, much of what officials regard as underused land is left intentionally fallow as part of the Anahuac people system of crop rotation. And the skill of the farmers has maintained the high quality of the soil, which is one of the things that attracted the agribusinesses to begin with. The peasant farmer's expertise, however, is disregarded, and the connection to the land is not only economic but spiritual. In our culture, one man in Gambela comments, going to a different place, being moved off the land, is unusual because God gave us this land. State intervention is almost always implicated in the transfer of common lands to private control, state and the market, again, working together. Nevertheless, in his critique of Laudato Si, free market advocate Philip Booth sets up the question of environmental stewardship as, quote, government control or private ownership. Again, those are the only two alternatives. Booth invokes a much-cited article from 1968 called The Tragedy of the Commons, in which Garrett Hardin argues that no one will take care of land over which no one has exclusive property rights. Booth acknowledges that Catholic social tradition places a social mortgage on private property. As Pope Francis writes, if we make something our own, it's only to administer it for the good of all. But Booth argues that rather than expecting people to use their property for the common good will be served by allowing people to use their property for self-interest. Right? This is Adam Smith's invisible hand, right? Everybody pursues their self-interest and magically it works out for the benefit of all. They would be more inclined to protect land to which they have exclusive property rights, is the argument. And this is what Francis calls, quote, a magical conception of the market, which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in the profits of companies or individuals, end quote. But Booth argues that there is empirical evidence that deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon is caused by insecure property rights and that this evidence is generalizable. Another study suggests that former British colonies have better records on deforestation because they allowed the so-called pioneers direct property rights, whereas in Spanish colonies, timber was the property of the crown to be exploited by a powerful elite, often living far from the land. So Booth accuses Francis of ignoring the importance of property rights for the protection of the environment. In one sense, both Booth and Francis agree on the principle of local control. What Booth ignores, however, is the question of how the pioneers came into possession of the land in the first place. And the answer to that question is they did so by violently dispossessing indigenous communities who owned the land in common. Deforestation was not a problem in the Amazon, for example, until the pioneers of European descent with international corporate ties began clear-cutting and burning enormous tracts of the jungle for logging and mining and agribusiness. This is a frightening representation of what's happened just over the last 60 or so years. The commons, in other words, was not a tragedy under indigenous control. The Amazon is being destroyed to sell beef to Burger King. The privatization of the commons is not captured by Booth's picture of hardy and responsible pioneers taking good care of their land, which they just happened to find free of people. It's rather, as Pierce documents, more generally a tale of coercion and exploitation. As political scientist, Catholic political scientist Michael Buddy says, this is an arresting quote, I think. Development is a violent, coercive process, an unrelenting war on the ability of peoples to provide for their most basic needs. This 500-year battle continues to push people further into depending for their survival on labor markets they do not control, investment policies they do not control, and ideological systems they do not control, all of which presuppose the inferiority of subsistence activities. This is not what we were taught to think of as development, right? But I think he's probably right if you examine the history of it. Booth seems to envision the commons as a kind of non-ownership. Pope Francis, on the other hand, quoting Scripture, attributes the ownership of everything to God, right? Psalm 24, the earth is mine and everything that's in it, says the Lord. Any human ownership, therefore, can only be a participation in God's ownership, which draws us out of the confines of the self and into communion with God's people and with God's creation. So all ownership is communal in the traditional Catholic view. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis refers to communitarian salvation, an experience of community in which the walls of the ego are torn down and the barriers of selfishness overcome. Isn't that a wonderful quote, right? This is not just economics we're talking about. This is spirituality as well. So a sane economy is one in which we recognize in our daily practices our inherent connection with one another and with God. So to determine when a market is truly free, it's not enough to rely on impersonal market forces or impersonal bureaucracies. A truly human economy needs to be on a personal scale. It needs to regard the ends of human goods as common, so we consider the good of all when we use our property and discern together what the common good is. Pope Francis is fully aware, however, that an emphasis on the personal and the local cannot do away with a broader vision. So at one extreme, Francis writes in his typically memorable way, quote, "People get caught up in an abstract, globalized universe, falling in step behind everyone else, admiring the glitter of other people's worlds, gaping and applauding at all the right times." Isn't that why Pope Francis is so great? Gaping and applauding at all the right times. At the other extreme, though, he says localism can become a museum of folklore, people clinging to the same old ways, incapable of being challenged by novelty and the beauty of other people, beauty of otherness. What's needed, Francis says, is to work, quote, on a small scale in our own neighborhood, but with a larger perspective. So in this last little bit, I want to talk about what that larger perspective is for Francis. And one way he articulates it is through this puzzling expression that he uses over and over. He says, time is greater than space. And I want to unpack what he means by that. He writes in his first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, time is always much greater than space. Space hardens processes, whereas time propels toward the future and encourages us to go forward in hope. He talks about this in Evangelii Gaudium again. One of the faults which we occasionally observe in socio-political activity is that spaces and power are preferred to time and processes. Giving priority to space means madly attempting to keep everything together in the present, trying to possess all the spaces of power and self-assertion. It's to crystallize processes, presume to hold them back. Giving priority to time, on the other hand, means being concerned about initiating processes rather than possessing spaces. And I won't give you another quote, same sort of thing he says in Laudato Si. What does this mean? Time is greater than space. I think it means three things. First, space indicates the desire to possess and control. Francis opposes the desire to ensure that all property be privately owned and that private property rights be absolute rather than qualified by the needs of others. The domination of spaces is related as well to his critiques of globalization, which is really a way of looking at the world from above that seeks to render all spaces permeable by global capital, right? Capital always moves freely across borders. Labor doesn't move freely across borders. And that, I think, is the context of Francis's famous response to Donald Trump regarding the Mexican border wall, right? The person who thinks of building walls instead of bridges is not Christian. Second, Francis links the priority of space over time with short-term thinking, this technological paradigm which is obsessed with immediate results which yield quick, easy, short-term political gains, which do not enhance human fullness. That's another quote. Attention to the timefulness of human life, on the other hand, requires patient listening to others, what he calls a genuine spiritual encounter. Again, spirituality. Taking the time to listen to what other people actually need. Joseph Stiglitz from the World Bank, used to work for the World Bank, would criticized how World Bank economists would fly into a country, spend 2 weeks talking to economists and other experts, staying in luxury motels, and then institute structural adjustments that had murderous effects on the poor in the country. Third, Francis is concerned not only with the quantity of time, but with the quality. He's concerned with an eschatological horizon of time, a view towards the future and already here, kingdom of God. So prioritizing time over space means looking ahead in hope to the kingdom of God as a model and not being constrained by what the world says is possible. So as he says in an interview, we need to do the little things of every day with a big heart open to God and to others. That means being able to appreciate the small things inside large horizons, those of the kingdom of God. Small things and large horizons. So the adage that time is greater than space appears in the future Pope Francis's writings as early as 1974, where it dovetails with this distinction between universalism and internationalism. Universalism, he says, is true Catholicity because it takes place through a mutual encounter that doesn't try to dissolve differences into uniform systems. On the other hand, what Bergoglio calls internationalism is a type of imperialist view from above that seeks to flatten out differences into interchangeable spaces. And he goes and he talks about the universal as the Jesuits and their reductions in South America, and the other view is the colonists, the Spanish and the Portuguese colonists. Bergoglio wrote that in the colonial period, the Society of Jesus confronted the then nascent liberal bourgeois attempts to homogenize the historical and human reality of the world through action conjoined to state centralism and Enlightenment rationalism to the detriment of the multifaceted richness of creation. And he contrasts this homogenizing internationalism with the Jesuits. This universalism was expressed in the Jesuit reductions, a network of Jesuit settlements of indigenous peoples that once covered territory the size of Western Europe in South America. Have you seen the movie The Mission with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, right? The Jesuits created these kind of utopias that lasted for 150 years in South America. Unlike the Spanish and the Portuguese pioneers who used the indigenous people as slave labor. All property was held in common in the Jesuit reductions. So the profits were shared by all. The decision-making was shared by all. They were governed by Indian councils. And the level of development in the Jesuit reductions in some places exceeded that in Western Europe at the time. This is roughly 1600 to 1750. The reductions became famous for their music and musical instruments. There's a lot of music in the movie. And according to Bergoglio's account, a little bit romanticized, but mostly accurate, the Jesuits sought to integrate the indigenous people into Christian society, but in a way that preserved their dignity and their culture from the predations of the colonizers. Bergoglio calls the Jesuit experiment a project of the heart, because it was a mutual encounter in which the Jesuits opened themselves to indigenous culture and the Indians opened themselves to the gospel. So despite flaws, the Jesuit reductions in South America were a remarkable experiment in creating alternative economic spaces based on communal ownership and local control. And it lasted for a century and a half until the Treaty of Bermuda in 1750. The Portuguese made war on the reductions and enslaved their inhabitants, and those in Spanish territory were brought to heel by the Crown, who expelled the Jesuits from Latin America in 1767. They took over the reductions. Here's a picture of a still standing reduction. See how beautiful it is. Still standing in Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil. Huge section of territory. But the Spanish took them over with the intent, as King Carlos wrote, quoted by Bergoglio, the noble intention of organizing this great kingdom and making uniform its political and economic system with that of the metropolis. And so, as the future Pope laments, the fecund universality that integrates and respects differences and idiosyncrasies was replaced by an absorbent metropolitan hegemony of a domineering kind. No longer was there a place for projects of the heart. It was an epoch of the enlightenment of the mind. So space had triumphed over time with disastrous and long-lasting effects. So to conclude, in the 21st century, the absorbent metropolitan hegemony of which Francis writes is not Spain, but the combination of multinational corporations based primarily in the US and Europe, and the military and diplomatic power of the United States government, which protects and promotes corporate interests both at home and abroad. State and market are not, in fact, opposing forces. While Pope Francis recognizes that state power can be and sometimes is used to curb corporate power on behalf of the common good, and he recognizes as well that there's good corporations doing good work there too. What he aims for is not the replacement of one homogenizing form of domination with another, but something richer and more diverse and more personalized. What he aims for are projects of the heart, economic spaces that facilitate face-to-face cooperation, encourage communal decision-making and ownership, and aim at the common good over private profit. He doesn't give contemporary examples of projects of the heart, so let me just close with one. There are thousands of cooperatives in Latin America where shared ownership and decision-making carry on the tradition of the reductions, which are generally seen in the literature as the first cooperatives, at least in Latin America. And such projects are not fantasies. Cooperatives employ nearly 10% of the world's workers. Just a report that came out last week put the number at almost 10%, like 290 million people. One such cooperative is Algodones Mayas in Guatemala. They are indigenous people who harvest wild cotton. Wild cotton still grows in Guatemala. They work it into fabric that they sell to this guy, Father Andrew O'Connor in New York City. He's actually not in the Bronx. He was just transferred to a parish in Lower Manhattan now. But he's a priest of the Archdiocese there, and he's a wonderful guy. He's a designer and an artist, and he designs clothes. And they have a workshop in his parish that uses the fabric from these Guatemalan cooperatives to make beautiful clothes. It's called Goods of Conscience. You can look it up on the internet. And there's a picture in Vogue magazine of Cameron Diaz wearing a pair of his shorts. I mean, this is like good stuff. He was featured in the Wall Street Journal, and he's this wonderful, beautiful, humble sort of guy. You can see him here. He has this whole theory of the parish as a place of production and not just consumption. So they have bees in his parish. They grow hops for the brewery down the street. That's what he's holding as the beer there. And it's this whole kind of a way of integrating this kind of spirituality of the economy as well. He says on his website, he writes, "Growing, spinning, and weaving the fabric in Guatemala, designing, cutting, and sewing in New York combines the soul of both communities. The work of globalization should result in friendly and mutual revelation, not anonymity." End quote. And that's a type of local action, but it sets this locality in this broader horizon of the kingdom of God. It's a type of project of the heart of which I think Pope Francis would very much approve. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cavanaugh. We have time for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions, and we have a microphone we can circulate.
Everybody was listening to the Cubs game.
Go ahead. Okay. My name is Cesar Pincheira. I was born in Chile. So I was in 75, in 73. You must be very familiar with the political system during Allende and Pinochet.
Yeah, I lived there from 87 to 89.
Yeah. And was a big influence of some American economists. I was in Notre Dame last week. Was a lecture from the time of President Bush 43, the chief of staff, and also the chief of staff of President Barack Obama. And they mentioned the global economy is bad. They recognize it's a bad situation, but the way it's coming now look like it's going to be more globalization.
Yeah.
Any way, I mean, look like Washington now is destroying the planet.
Yeah, you won't get an argument from me on that one.
Yeah, I mean, 1975 you mentioned, that was actually the year that Milton Friedman visited Chile. General Pinochet had taken over the government in 1973, and they brought in what were called Los Chicago Boys, the Chicago economists, the kind of free market economists like Milton Friedman, and he visited a couple of times. On one trip in 1975, he said that the Chilean economy needed shock treatment, which was a really bad choice of words because at the time the regime was torturing thousands of people with electricity. And that's precisely what I think Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, kind of picks up on that as well, right? Capitalism has been called creative destruction, and some people embrace that. And that's there are winners and losers in any of that kind of process. It shakes up the world, and there are winners in the process, but there's losers as well. And I think Pope Francis is particularly keen that we look at what happens to the losers and really what happens to the winners as well in this process, because it's massively disruptive of traditional forms of community. And that's really what I think he wants us to pay particular attention to. There's a constant drumbeat of development and growth and efficiency and so on. And unfortunately, that is always the view from above, right? And we don't often hear about what's happening on the ground. But if you're an expert, you look at the world as an expert, right? There's a great book by James C. Scott from Yale called Seeing Like a State. And he talks about the way that this kind of view from above, you kind of change the reality on the ground to make it fit with things that enhance your power, right? Listening to peasants doesn't enhance your power, and that's what I think Pope Francis is really trying to be particularly attentive to. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. My name is Molly Gower. I teach in the Department of Religious Studies here. I think the notion of freedom from intervention or freedom from coercion or being forced to do something is one that comes almost instinctively to you as Americans.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the notion of freedom for in the Christian tradition, and as you presented it here, freedom for human flourishing.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more, expand on that, freedom
Sure.
for human flourishing.
Yeah. I think the distinction, the formal distinction between positive and negative freedom comes from Isaiah Berlin in the middle of the 20th century. But it's an ancient, this is what you find in St. Augustine, right, who says that paradoxically, the more I find myself wrapped up in God's will, the freer I am, right? I'm most enslaved when I obey my own will, right, which he describes as a kind of sickness and slavery, right? He says that being able to sin is not a strength, it's a weakness. And so the example I often use with my students is, I'm an alcoholic, I got $20 in my pocket and the liquor store is open. I'm free in a negative sense, but in a positive sense, I'm kind of deeply unfree. And there's this deep kind of compulsion and slavery going on there. So freedom in a positive sense is something like playing the piano, right? I can't just do whatever I want. There are certain disciplines that I need to submit to. But if I submit to those disciplines, that allows for this tremendous creativity and this tremendous beauty and joy. If I sit down at a piano and nobody stops me from touching the keys, I'm free in a negative sense, and that's good and that's necessary, but it's not enough for me to play the piano. I actually have to kind of go through the disciplines of learning it, and then I'll have both negative and positive freedom, and that's the kind of fullness of freedom. So the attentiveness to who's got power to do what in the relationship is precisely what some of these definitions of free markets try to exclude. And I think Pope Francis rightly sees that you can't exclude those things without really distorting what life looks like.
Yeah, thanks.
Could I add a question connected? I would like to add a question about Iraq, because with your knowledge you can tell us if it's true or not, because sometimes we get some information which is not true, or sometimes true and
Fake news?
and I think when USA took over Iraq, General Gardner was there from the beginning to organize the government, and he lasted only, I think, a month or 2 months, because he was replaced by Dr. Brennan, which was administrative, and he applied the same economic in Chile, like globalization and free markets. And what happened was that destroyed the economy in Iraq, create a 60% unemployment. And all the factories, they had to close because they couldn't compete with the Chinese product. And General Gardner, they have the Shia, all the tribe getting together to make a government and to make their own decision and live like a country. But Bremen took over and create a chaos that we are all paying now. It's a big, totally different when Bush said we're going to be, in 3 days, we are going to take over, and how many years?
Yeah.
I wonder if you can...
Yeah, thanks. I don't know much about the economic condition after the war, other than it was generally chaotic. But I think the example is illustrative of what Pope Francis is trying to say here. I mean, one of the things that's at root of this is the impulse to change the world. Right? I mean, unfortunately, this is what you're getting at universities across the country these days. Go out and change the world, right? I mean, every university has that as their motto. I can't tell you how many billboards I've seen, come here and change the world. And in some ways, I think the world has had enough of well-meaning Americans trying to change it, right? And this is an example. I mean, trying to do good. There's something deeply right about that impulse, of course, to want to change things, to make things better and so on. But it sometimes leads people to do things with the assumption that we can kind of swoop down on anybody in the world and fix their problems. And oftentimes it's done very coercively, obviously in the case of military interventions. And the next war is always going to fix what the last war broke, right? And there's something deeply kind of, the primordial sin in Genesis 3:5 is, eat of this and you will be like gods. And there's this kind of godfulness that we want to kind of take upon ourselves. We are in charge of history and not God is in charge of history. And that, I think, has very dangerous consequences many times. Yeah. I mean, my alma mater, I think, has a really bad case of change the world-itis, which is often very good. It's wonderful. But sometimes I think we need to, ratchet it down and have a little bit more humility.
What's that? Oh, them? Oh, them. Shocking, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. On a more uplifting note, since a lot of sort of the alternative spaces of these projects of the heart are often, I think in popular culture they're thought of as sort of fantasies, right? We're locked in this binary system whether we like it or not. And in college we could think about alternatives, but it's just there. So this is a great example. Can you think of another? Can you give us another example, just off the top of your head, of another sort of cooperative like this?
Sure, yeah. There's a corporation in Spain called the Mondragon Corporation, which last year had over $3 billion in sales. It's a big operation, and it's run entirely on cooperative principles. It was founded in the 1940s by a Basque priest named Jose Maria Arizmendiarrieta, which is a great last name. And based on distributist principles, so principles coming out of the Catholic social tradition. And it's a rather large corporation, but it's entirely worker-owned and entirely worker-governed. The highest paid worker can't make more than 6 times what the lowest paid worker, the average in the U.S. is over 400 times the average CEO gets for the average line worker. And it's done in this, and so lots of studies have been done. The communities where Mondragon is active in Spain have much higher rates of happiness, lower rates of suicide, better health, better just general kind of well-being. And there's no reason why companies can't be run on these bases. I mean, it's not, people think in terms of these, eccentric little niche places, but this is a very successful and fairly large corporation, but it's run entirely on cooperative principles. And that report that came out last week about 10% of the world's workers work for cooperatives, that shows that these are not niche things at all, and it's not an impossible dream, and it's not socialism, right, at all, really. It's not, Stalinism. I mean, it's the opposite of that. It's actual people actually having control of their own lives. I mean, that I think is what Michael Buddy is talking about with the story of development over the last 500 years. It's just taking local control away from people. It's what Ivan Illich used to call the war on subsistence. We know better than you do. You poor farmers there, we're going to come and we're going to improve your lives. And the first thing we're going to do is push you off your land and make you, go work in factories or whatever. And that, it just doesn't have to be that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Last question.
I'd like you to comment on the question of whether the economics that you're talking about isn't required to increase the growing population of the earth, and what comment you would have on the church's position that birth control, which contributes to, or the lack of it, contributes to the problems of the growing population.
Yeah.
I'm not my area of specialization. I don't do sexual ethics. Yeah, that's a tough one. What's that?
I don't either, typically.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, I don't know if I'm going to be able to solve the question of humana vitae and artificial contraception tonight, and there's something in me that says don't go down that road, because that's a complicated issue. It does seem to me that comments both made by Pope Benedict XVI and by Pope Francis have indicated some flexibility on some of these questions when it comes to life or death situations. Pope Benedict famously said that in Africa, if you've got situations where you've got a male prostitute with HIV, then maybe contraception might be the first step towards a more responsible kind of sexual relationship. And I think there might be something there that where you could kind of talk about the ideal, but then talk about how to get towards the ideal, rather than simply holding up the ideal and saying, this is it and you better do it. So that's my small intervention on that. But the problem that you raise about global population growth, I mean, that's the reason that you often get, always, I think, I'm going to say almost always, the reason why large-scale monocropping and agribusinesses need to get what they get is precisely because this is more efficient, right? And I think that's been proven to be false. James Scott shows, there are studies that show that large-scale monocropping is not more efficient, that in fact small-scale agriculture is more efficient in the long run. And the advantages that large-scale agribusinesses enjoy are advantages not in yield per acre. They're advantages in access to credit, access to markets, and political influence. And so I think those kinds of arguments need to be countered, because we assume automatically that the technocratic paradigm that must be better, and I think in fact it's not.
Yeah, a little easier one for you. When you talk about the market versus the state, it reminds me of the presidential election last year. It seems like people were choosing, they felt like they had to choose if we want a state-run economy, do we want a corporate-run economy?
Yeah.
And they chose the corporate-run.
Yeah.
What do you think the chances are of Pope Francis running for president?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, 0. But that would be interesting if we found somebody like him to run for president. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's the narrative, right? You got to choose between the state or the corporation. And what I hope that people can see is just how densely intertwined they are, and also the idea that a billionaire is going to be the champion of the working class. I mean, I think on the face of it, that's just a real hard one to swallow. But people do swallow that because the narrative is that the business class are job creators, right? So you need to throw more money at them because they will create jobs for us. So they're the heroes of the modern economy. And there used to be, not so long ago, a kind of narrative where working people in unions would say, we're the protagonists, right? You know, we make the things, and we are united, and we're going to have some say in this, and we're going to have some power in the economy. And now the narrative is, well, we just need to bow down before the job creators, and they will do it for us, and then we will thank them for creating jobs for us, even if they happen to be low-paying jobs and so on. And so I really think that the conversation is ready for a reset, really desperately needs a reset. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Cavanaugh.
Thanks, everybody.